Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. My name is Chris Sainty. I am the British Ambassador to Portugal, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to the second in our series of workshops in which we explore the question, is science advice for policy useful in modern societies? This is a joint project organised by the British Embassy in Lisbon in collaboration with the Centre for Philosophy of Sciences of the University of Lisbon. Some of you, I know, also attended our first workshop last Thursday, so thank you all very much for coming back this week. It also means that I must try not to repeat myself too much, as you will have heard me say some of these words last time. But I would like to repeat myself in the sense of thanking the Centre for Philosophy of Sciences, and in particular, Dr. Mara Almeida, for fantastic support in planning and delivering this project. I'd also like to extend my thanks to the wonderful panel of speakers and moderators that we have with us for giving us their valuable time today as well. So today's session, very briefly, is going to focus on the role of science advice for governments. Once again, this is an incredibly topical and relevant theme in today's world, in which decision makers are required to make judgments about incredibly complex and challenging matters, ranging from climate change to the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. It is self-evident, I think, that science has a fundamental role to play in providing evidence and data to shape public policies that respond to these great challenges. And we've seen over and over again during the last 12 months, the COVID pandemic, with all our governments concluding pretty quickly, I think, that we need the best scientists and the best science to beat the virus. Now, I said a few words last week about the framework that the UK has developed for effective science advice, an effective science advisory process, both within government and also to Parliament. I'm not going to describe all of that again, not least because we're lucky enough to be joined today by Professor Carol Mandel, who is the Chief International Science Envoy and Chief Scientific Advisor at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in the UK. So she's far better placed than me to explain how science is integrated into policy making in government in the UK. And Carol has been a fantastic supporter of the work that we've been doing to develop the science relationship between the UK and Portugal. And I would like just to take the opportunity to thank her very much indeed for her support throughout my time here in Lisbon. A crucial part of effective scientific advice is communication. It's really important, of course, that the evidence on which decisions are based is clearly communicated, including on those occasions when policy decisions appear to some people to be maybe inconsistent with scientific advice. And this was a point that was picked up by both the speakers and the audience in our session last week. How can we ensure a good match between transparency, public involvement, and the right communication between different stakeholders? And I'm sure we'll be hearing some interesting insights into that aspect this morning. And again, I said this last week, but I don't want to imply that the way we do things in the UK is perfect. Of course it's not. We're always keen to learn from the experience of others. And that's a large part of the motivation behind organising these workshops. But we are, of course, confident that a robust system of science advice improves the quality of our policy making. So, as I said, we want to share our experience, we want to hear about the experience of others, and we want to keep thinking about the ways in which we can collaborate, and in my case, with Portugal on these issues. And more widely, of course, I also wanted to use this opportunity to underline once again the importance that I attach to UK-Portugal bilateral collaboration on science and innovation. Maintaining our friendly relationship and close scientific collaboration with Portugal and our other European partners is really nothing but good news. So that's enough words from me by way of introduction. Without further ado, I will hand over to Mara Almeida to provide a short introduction to today's discussion. I warmly encourage you all to participate and submit questions in what I hope will be a very lively and interesting session. I hope you enjoy it, and please join us again on the 25th of March for the third and last of these workshops. So with those words, thank you very much indeed, and enjoy the session.
Also, good morning. Welcome everybody to the second workshop, also on my behalf. And many thanks for joining us from different parts of Portugal and also from other parts of the world. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Manuel. I'm a researcher at the Center for Philosophy of Science of the University of Lisbon. And I have been working at the interface of science and policy for a few years now, so it's a great pleasure for me to be here today. Of course, also I would like to thank all the speakers and the moderator for having accepted the invitation to participate in this second session of this three-part conference, as well to all the participants present today, but also to many of whom who also have participated in the first workshop that took place last week. I would like also to the ambassador to share with you some, at least for me, some of the key issues that came out from the last session, which was Science for Policy, What Does It Mean, that took place last Thursday, which there was the opportunity to discuss several issues, and some of them which I thought were relevant was, for instance, the challenging and the difficulty role of the science advisors. And one of the speakers, Heather Douglas, actually proposed a model for science advice in which 3 lines of obligation for the science advisor should be considered, more specifically to the scientific community, to the advisee, and to the broader public. So I thought it was very interesting model that was discussed, and how the management of this 3 audience by the science advisor will be relevant for trust to be built in the work that science advisors do. And also another point that came out was exactly the public and media scrutiny for the role and structures for advice, which we have been seeing now during the COVID pandemic. For example, questioning if these structures are sufficiently transparent and employing the right mix of expertise. Issues which for a long time have been discussed by science policy researchers and practitioners, but now have been very much highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And the last point that I would also like to bring was the issue of hope, the hope of transformation, in the sense of how COVID-19 pandemic could have or not the potential to move us forward in science advice. So it would be interesting also to have this points brought to this session, to the session of today, because this session is also to share some insights on the existing processes, mechanisms, and structures that provide scientific advice to the governments in Europe. But also, I think it would be interesting to consider some of the challenges and guiding principles of providing scientific advice to policymakers, and especially, of course, in context of complexity and uncertainty, as is being illustrated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So I hope you enjoy. It's great to have you all present today. I would also like to thank the embassy and for the interest on wanting to collaborate on this such timely issue. So thank you all, and I pass now to David, the moderator.
Perfect. Thank you, Mara. So I will be today's moderator, and it's a great pleasure to welcoming you to this morning's workshop on the science advice to government. Why is it relevant? And especially it's a pleasure to welcoming you to what I hope will be a stimulating discussion this morning, featuring actually some of the world's leading experts on science advice. So we have a very interesting discussion in front of us. I'm David Butz Petersen. I'm a professor of science communication in Copenhagen, including a research portfolio on what we could call the science of science advice, which we will not address today. What we will address today is different countries' approaches to scientific advice throughout the pandemic and beyond, inviting different perspectives from around Europe and worldwide. I think it's safe to say, as a starting point, that scientific advice has never been in greater demand. The COVID-19 pandemic has clearly illustrated, possibly more than ever before, the importance of science advice in policymaking. So if it wasn't already clear in advance, I guess the pandemic has shown how key elements of public policy are intimately connected to and also dependent on the provision of evidence, expertise, and data, including, as was already said, informed understanding of uncertainties. So you have all witnessed the government agencies around the world rushing towards scientists, research centers, and universities to seek advice, organizing both internal science services in government to rapidly respond to the emerging crisis, as well as also acquiring and synthesizing knowledge from external resources, exploiting both established mechanisms and structures of science advice, as well as also enabling new mechanisms, innovations in the ecosystem. So COVID-19 has, as has been said many times before, in many ways been a stress test to the scientific advisory ecosystem with mixed feedback and performance, which I hope we can also address throughout today's workshop. Now the big question remains, what have we learned? How can the crucial role played by scientific advice in pandemic management be translated and further explored in other areas of policymaking, such as climate change, cybersecurity, poverty, social mobility, food technologies, or immigration, now looking ahead into the future? And why, as it said in the workshop program, is it relevant in the first place to use scientists and scholars to inform and shape public decision making? What do scientists, engineers, and other experts bring to the policy process that is complementary to the role of policymakers themselves, to the media, and to the wider public? And also looking back at the last decade, how can we ensure the integrity and legitimacy of those experts informing government when they are subjected to increased scrutiny, particularly in controversial areas such as vaccine hesitancy, climate change, or artificial intelligence? As Sir Peter, one of our distinguished speakers today, said in a lecture in 2014, scientific advice has never been in greater demand, nor has it been more contested. So with these words, I would like to open today's workshop and introduce our speakers. You each have 15 minutes for presentations, followed by 5 minutes of questions, and I will be responsible of keeping the time. And after the 4 presentations, we will have a plenary debate and Q&A with the audience. So please make sure that we will have a lively and engaging session today, posting your questions. For extended resumes of our speaker, I would direct your attention to the website. So first, let me introduce Renzo Tomellini. He's the head of a unit at the European Commission, DG Research and Innovation, and he's responsible for the services to the chief scientific advisors, to the scientific advice mechanism, the same, and to the European Group of Ethics in Science and New Technologies. So please, Renzo, over to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for welcoming. We have been welcomed 3 times this morning, so I feel very welcomed. And I would like to raise immediately the attention on the European Union policy and laws making. So European policies and laws, like all policies and laws that are adopted in today, affect citizens and businesses for generations to come. And in Europe, we have defined the so-called better regulation agenda. Better regulation agenda, which is a way of making policy. So European Union action should be based on evidence. And immediately you see where I want to come. Should be the understanding of the impact of laws on citizens and businesses, simplifying the laws, making decision-making more open and transparent, allowing citizens, businesses, and stakeholders to contribute to policy and lawmaking. So inclusivity, transparency, impact, evidence-based. You see the importance of what the science to policy advice makes indeed for the evidence base of the European and in general of policy making. David already heard me mentioning the difference between the policy shaping and the policy making, the decision shaping, the decision taking. Of course, there are roles very clear for politicians, roles for scientists, intended in the very broad sense. So, second keyword that I want to introduce after the concept of better regulation for policy and laws is the concept of impact that a scientific advice needs to have. Impact means that should be pronouncement, should be an advice, and this advice should be heard, should be taken up. I don't say that should be literally followed word by word, but should be considered, duly considered. So the fact of having impact for the scientific advice is the second important keyword that I want to raise, that brings us to the concept of an ecosystem of science advice delivery. An ecosystem that includes those who give the advice and those who have to listen to the advice, and includes the mechanism. That's why the science advice mechanism that regulates, that drives the functioning of this process. David kindly mentioned our role, our unit. Our unit is indeed on science policy, on science advice and ethics and integrity of researchers. So we have a very complex portfolio that addresses the ecosystem of the science advice and the science advice per se via ensuring the support to the group of the chief scientific advisors. That is the slide that kindly our Portuguese hosts have put now. Only one slide I will show, only this one. That is indeed how it works. We start from the policy priorities, whichever they are, wherever there is the need of science advice. And interesting that the science advice that the chief scientific advisors are asked to deliver does not address research per se. The policy for science is not addressed because we have other mechanisms. By the way, my previous work was exactly to hold the pen for the framework program proposal Horizon Europe. It was my previous assignment. And the chief scientific advisors are asked to deliver scientific opinion on non-research or not only research. Research can be only marginal issues. So I mentioned in the slide the Green Deal, making Europe fit for digital age, health union, and if you read the recently adopted Commission decision on beating cancer plan, you will adopt it on the 3rd of February, so very, very recent. You will indeed read that in the Beating Cancer Plan, it is written that the scientific advisors will be asked to deliver an opinion on this in this area. You see that there will then be a request for advice, a request of advice that is discussed with the chief scientific advisors, in order to have the right formulation. Too many times we saw questions from our policy making colleagues that are too technicistic or too generic. So this, it is important that there is an interface discussion to have the right formulation for the advice to be delivered. And after this discussion between the chief scientific advisors and the colleagues in policymaking, mediated by us, there is the first document that is published, the scoping paper. The scoping paper is framing what should be done. On the basis of this, there is a review of scientific evidence, and I think all the participants know the European Association of Academies, Science Academies, the association, the SAPIA consortium, that gathers a large number of academies in Europe, and they deliver a evidence review on the area of interest. And this is also something that is made publicly available. Automatically you have the factor time, because I was mentioning as a keyword impact for the scientific advice, but also the fact the keyword time is essential for the scientific advice. We know very well that a diagnosis when if I'm already dead, it's called autopsy, and it is not really what we want. We want to be treated, and we want to do better. So the factor time is essential. In some cases, the chief scientific advisors are asked to deliver very rapidly within weeks, as it has been the case very recently on the COVID, in the beginning of the COVID crisis. And in this case, they deliver a statement without a complete review of scientific evidence by SAPEA. If there is the time, months, so not weeks, but months, then SAPEA is engaged, and they can deliver the scientific advice, on the basis of which the chief scientific advisors they develop their scientific advice. And in the slide you see possible expert hearings, stakeholders meeting, and so on, until they deliver the scientific opinion that goes back to the policymakers and goes feeds the proposal for policy or legislation, and then follows the normal policy making process in the Union. And this is central when appropriate for within the agenda of the better regulation. So evidence-based legislations and regulation, this requires again impact. Impact requires actors and mechanisms, like it is the case of the group of the chief scientific advisors, but this requires also an entire ecosystem that involves all the actors, not only those who give the advice, those who gather and elaborate the scientific knowledge, those who will be listening to the advice, and all these should be done within an appropriate time. Particular challenge is has been seen in the case of the COVID, when the advice is requested at the frontier of the knowledge. At the frontier of the knowledge, politicians, we know well, they want the opinion of science. The opinion of science, and this is not yet consolidated, or may not be all consolidated when we are at the frontier of the knowledge, so that it is important that politicians also understand that the opinion of science is being created, and then scientists have an opinion, so that the opinion of scientists can also be in a dialectic position before the opinion of science is distilled and cast in a stable manner. This made also the subject of the statement that I was mentioning at the beginning of the COVID crisis, that was delivered by the group, the chief scientific advisors, in order to raise the issue that attention to the political world, that when you hear different voices, once again, is the opinion of the scientist at the frontier of knowledge. It's not nothing strange, but it is absolutely part of the scientific method. And we go back now to Galileo Galilei, we go back to the very heart of the scientific method. I would just now stop here and leave then time to the discussion. I apologize, I will have to disappear for some 40 minutes because the top political masters summon me, but for 20 minutes, and then I'm back in this session.
Thank you. Thank you, Renzo. I'm having a bit of echo here. So we didn't have any questions coming through yet from the audience in our Q&A function, but I'm sure they will come along. But perhaps one question I could pose to you, Renzo, is the question of whether you are allowed in the SAM to initiate your own advisory processes, or you're only acting on request from the higher level political community. So what is the balance between you being able to put out recommendations or policy papers or evidence yourself, or the group of science advisors, and the request that you're responding to?
Yes, correctly, you said not myself, because within the mechanism with the group of chief scientific advisors, we hold the secretariat, even if we are the unit on science policy. So in reality, our mandate is much broader and encompasses the science to policy advice. But for the chief scientific advisors, we hold the secretary. They are sovereign, they are independent, and this is one of the keys, the key features of the scientific advisors, who should be competent, who should be independent, who should be transparent and free from bias as much as possible. I don't believe that anybody of us can be free from biases, but it's important that everybody says which are our own biases. For me, for instance, spectroscopy is the most important research field, because I was a spectroscopist, so it's obvious that I loved my job. So, having made clear that our role with the chief scientific advisors is very respectful role, respectful to their independence and competence. The chief scientific advisors are appointed by the commission decision. Commission means literally the 27 commissioners, not the services, but the political level. So they are appointed. And there is an independent identification committee to propose names, select names and propose names for this appointment. The regulations say indeed that they should work upon request of the political power, but Article 2, C2, that's if you want to see, you will see that the chair of the group of chief scientific advisors has the right to propose, to offer the European Commission and European institutions an opinion by their own initiative. So the reply is yes, there is both the delivering an advice upon request and offering by initiative. And this is important because yesterday you were mentioning foresighting, for instance. It's very interesting how to link foresight with advice, because we need to have a predictive role. We don't have to be reactive. We have to be proactive, and we have to be predictive. And so this power, the group of chief scientific advisor has this power.
Right. Thank you, Renzo. We have one more question coming through from the audience. To what extent is the EU setup comparable to larger groupings such as the United Nations and the way science advice is provided among international organizations? Do you have any reflections, Renzo?
No, you have to ask them. I know that under Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, this was pretty much high in the radar and in the policy agenda. For this, you should ask the United Nations, and then please tell me. But I leave here for the 20 minutes I will be off, Dr. Allegra, who may provide some hints in this sense. Maybe, I don't know. But in any case, he will be here. But for this, I said you ask them, and then you tell me.
Okay, thank you, Renzo. Well, before we will let Alessandro in, I will move on to the next speaker, and we will then reconvene for final discussion. Thank you. So our next speaker is José Manuel Mendoza. He's a professor at the Department of Industrial Engineering and Management at the University of Porto. And he's also the chairman of the National Council for Science, Technology and Innovation in Portugal. Among other high-level roles and appointments. So welcome to the workshop, Jose, and please take the floor.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, all of you. Thank you very much to the British Embassy for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here and have the opportunity to share our experience. I have some slides and I will need some help from you to pass on the slides. I will just bring up the experience of an RTO, a research and technology organization, on public policy advice. And of course the case of INESCTEC and our experience. Next slide, please. So the first thing is building competences. How do you become capable of giving advice on public policies? More than that, how do you become capable of supporting public policies? Next slide, please. And we start with an institution which is spread out north of Portugal in 3 or 4 different cities, and which is a multi-institutional association which has universities, 3 universities, 1 polytechnical school as partners, and whose mission is to foster pervasive intelligence, because we work in the digital, artificial intelligence and those areas, to excel in research, but research with social and economic impact. We also have a Brussels hub with our institutions, other institutions, and an institute in Brazil with major Brazilian universities. Next slide, please. Just a few numbers. We are about 1,000 people, 700 integrated researchers and 350 PhD researchers. In a European level or international level, maybe this is not a lot, but we are perhaps the largest R&D and technology transfer institute in Portugal in the engineering area. So our researchers, our PhDs, come from academia, and also they are contact people, professionals. And we work with projects, almost 400 ongoing projects in parallel, and each year more than 200 people go to the market, and among them some dozens of PhDs. Among these projects, we have European projects, collaborative projects with companies, more fundamental science projects, and technology transfer projects. Next slide, please. Our motto is from knowledge generation to science-based innovation. And we work with a kind of push-pull model, turning science into impact, into economic value. We have 13 research centers which are grouped in 4 clusters. And then we have 5 strategic platforms addressing societal challenges and markets in agro-food, energy, health, industry, and sea. So we have a, next slide please, a broad range of competencies. The research lines are grouped in these 4 clusters, as I mentioned. We are mainly based on digital technologies, communication, electronics, automation, robotics, but then the soft part, the intelligent part, which is put into this hardware technology, computer science, AI, decision support. So it's a capability of looking at the technology in an integrated manner, not only the hardware, the physics, the basics, but also then the programming, all the intelligence that you can put in devices. Next slide, please. Since we pursue science with impact, we have these platforms addressing real-world challenges. And if you see the common in the bottom, the common word is digital. Digitalization, ICT, because digital is pervasive and digital brings intelligence to the devices, the systems, the components, the technologies. Next, please. Since science is global already, although innovation is necessarily local in the companies, in the territories, we have many international partnerships in Europe, outside of Europe, with American universities, with companies, different types of organization. We are in 3 EIT organizations, in institutes, in KICS, manufacturing, digital and raw materials, and so forth. And then maybe we skip the next slide and go to the second part, please. So 2 slides away. Okay. So now supporting public policies. Okay, saying to the government and to government bodies, hey, we are here to help. Maybe we can help you. And then next slide. I will just go very quickly through 5 different ways of supporting public policies. Supporting public policies is beyond giving advice. Of course, we have to give advice, but it's more than giving advice. And the first set is the emergency situations. And I just chose three cases. One was something that happened in 2017 after the very large fires, the Pedrógão fires in Portugal. And we advised the government on what happened with the emergency communication systems that collapsed. And the collapse of the emergency communication systems was a really serious thing. So what happened? And then what should be improved? What were the weak points? What were the technologies? What was wrong? What was right? And this was very important and it was highly impactful. And this is the picture on the left. Then after that is another tragedy in 2019 in the south of Portugal. 100-meter long road collapsed into a 50-meter pit of a marble quarry full of water. And there were submerged vehicles that nobody could find. And the Navy asked us, and our very sophisticated underwater robot was able to locate vehicles to be taken out of the water. So you have to have technology in the front end if you want to really help. It was a drama. It was a very delicate political situation. A few years before, something similar with the collapse of the bridge made the collapse of the government. So just for you to see how tough it was. And then the last examples come from the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We were involved with our European researchers from Switzerland, England, UK, Germany, France, to develop a model for the digital contact tracing applications, and we developed the Stay Away COVID, which was the official Portuguese digital contact tracing application in just 2 or 3 months. Another small example was when the pandemic was in a really threatening situation in April, May, we developed a low-cost emergency ventilator with a self-inflating bag to help for an emergency of lack of ventilators that were feeling that was happening all around Europe. Next slide, please. So now we move to another area, electrical energy area. The energy area, we are very strong in this area. In 2006, we helped the government in the wind power public auction, leading to the concessions of 1,400 megawatt of wind power, leading also to an industrial cluster with companies building equipment for the wind power installations. And the impact was that Portugal was world leader with a number of hours in which the country was only fed up with renewables. And in March, this was in 2016, and in March 2018, a new world record, 100% of the country's electrical energy from renewable sources during 1 full month. And further on, we have been working with low voltage network concessions, renewables in Madeira and grid, Azores Graciosa Green Island, which is 100% green energy, the solar energy, the solar generation auctions, the future architectures of the Iberian electricity markets, HVDC connections with Africa, lots of regulations and bylaws, always supporting the government, not just advising, but making things for the government that consultants or that assessors are not able to do. Next slide, please. The third is our contribution to the modernization of Portuguese industry. We helped shoe sector, which is a kind of traditional mature sector, to pass on from 200 million to 2,000 million euros in footwear exports. with many sophisticated projects for improving flexibility, agility, short stocks, etc., etc., etc. And now, more recently, helping in the agro industry with wine harvesting robots for Dodo region, greenhouse, etc. Definition, not just the national, but also European innovation agendas, participating in smart specialization strategies, manufacture platform in Europe, made in Europe public-private partnerships, and supporting the policies in Portugal in these areas. Next, please. And also helping the innovation ecosystem to grow, to improve and consolidate. We participate in 10 out of 30 collaborative laboratories, which are new institutions doing research and technology transfer for different areas. For instance, in the forest, in vines, in the sea, in agriculture, etc. And participating also in 11 out of 14 industry competitiveness clusters, which are similar to the French pôle de compétitivité. Next slide, please. So we may say that we may be contributing to Portugal and the northern region reaching the position of strong innovators in 2020 European Innovation Scoreboard, contributing to the innovation of SMEs, to the innovation of the research system, to improving human resources. And we have been doing regular consultancy to the Minister of Science and to the Minister of Economy and to the regional bodies, even contributing to several legislative regulations and bylaws. Now, 2 slides more to finish. Next slide, please. Another important project was the support to the improvement of digital competencies of the Portuguese population, the so-called INCO 2030. We coordinated a national program on higher education and training in digital competencies. And we were helping a lot in the polytechnical schools in having upskilling programs in digital technologies that in 2019-20 have 10,000 young students being upskilled with digital technologies. Just to finish, to conclude, last slide, please. Where is the knowledge for policy advice? The following are problems Portugal has. We'll offer Portuguese government the best advice on the location of the new airport. It's a big polemic. We'll advise on the huge investments on hydrogen. There's a European strategy and Portugal wants to go with bandwagon. So what are the options? We'll advise on the complex smart grid regulations, on the fiscal policy for the electrical vehicles, on underwater mining licenses, on 5G and all the public health issues raised by the pandemic. So are there the successors of the ministers and the secretaries of state? Do you order, do we have a study made by one of the big 4 consulting companies? Do you look for individual scientists? Much too often real prima donnas, chief technology offices, advisory committees, like it was said recently, the government created this National Council for Science, Technology and Innovation, and I was invited to be the president. And it has people from companies, people from research, people from different areas, and the first thing was to ask our opinion about this program from recovery and resilience, but many other things may be on the table. There are many options. None of them is perfect, but one thing we are deeply convinced that you need sound, in-depth knowledge, you need multidisciplinarity, you need freedom of opinion, independence. You need reasonable scientific consensus. When I say reasonable, it's because there are some areas, some new forefront technology areas where it's hard to have scientific consensus. You need all these, but these are hard to find altogether. So we believe this can be found in institutions much more than in individuals, even if it is the brilliant scientist that can come upon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jose. We have a couple of questions, and to start with, I would like to pose one myself as well. So perhaps you could give us an insight into the mechanisms through which you're advising government. So what would be your preferred formats? Would you be invited to meetings or seminars, or would you write up reports, or give input to statements to the government? So how do you in reality advise the government?
Well, there are different formats. If there are large, important, highly responsibility projects, like for instance the regulations and for a wind power auction of 1,600 megawatts, of these big solar auctions, or bylaws and regulations, okay, then the government discuss it with us and we have a contract, okay? So we are paid for it. There are teams of people working for months, usually it's not years, but for months, in an independent and competent way, and free from all the strings attached to companies or interests, etc., etc. Okay, because we are private, non-profit, public interest. We are a public interest institution. Sometimes the government picks up our experts and nominates advisory committees on something. Okay, and this is a pro bono work, an advisory work in certain areas. For instance, we are frequently consulted by the Minister for Science and Technology on regulations of the statute of careers for PhDs, of grant holders. Why? Because we have 36 years of experience on how to do it. And we have seen many rules, things that work and do not work. So we just offer our experience as an institution, not as a person, as an institution which has many persons, which has a memory, which has a kind of background. So there are many ways in which, and then we are involved in many studies like smart specialization strategies and things like other institutions. When I give our example, is because it's the one I know better, and because I'm convinced we have been doing it very intensively. But there are other institutions that offer support to the government in other areas, like environment or like public health, etc., which are not our areas. Our areas are engineering and ICT based systems, like I have described.
Right. Okay. No, thank you. That's a very comprehensive answer. We have two questions from the audience. So one question is whether civil society and also other business organizations can ask for scientific advice concerning public issues to you.
Yes, we also help not only the government, but for instance, industry associations, company associations, right, that ask us, and we give them advice. Sometimes it's for free if it is something which is light, if it is 1 or 2 days work, it's informal. If they want something more structured, heavier, requiring an in-depth study, okay, then we have to do a contract, because we have to pay our staff, of course. Sometimes even individual people send us emails and questions, and we try to reply. And since many of our researchers are professors at the university, faculty, the students or ex-students that are in a company that are somewhere send an email and ask for something, and we try to, of course, to help and reply, and in our domains of competences, giving the advice we are able to do.
All right. Okay. Perhaps in connection to that, another member of the audience asks how you're establishing your connections to policymakers. So is it mainly so that you are offering your advice on key areas of competence, or do you, or is it more the decision makers who's like knocking on to the insect tech door?
Yeah, it's mostly the decision makers that knock on our door. Not just the government bodies, but for instance, the regions, the North region, the Center region, even Lisbon region, in certain areas, we are visible enough for them to understand that we may do this. And of course, after 36 years of work, there are people that know people and the personal links. Regarding this National Council for Science, Technology and Innovation, it's a bit different because it has autonomy and independence, and it may take the initiative to advise the government in this domain or this area or this event or this subject. Okay, so this National Council, which was recently created 1 month ago, less than 1 month ago, it may have the initiative of coming to the government, advising and offering public positions on issues of its competencies. But usually it's the decision makers that come to us and discuss and ask.
Right. Okay, I think we have time for a last question also before we let you go. And that's a question about your areas of specialization, how you came to specialize in the areas that you are currently authoritative in, and whether you would like to, as an organization, to evolve more organically, perhaps branch out or diversify into other areas of speciality in the future.
Yeah, we have been. We were born 36 years ago. And the basics is ICT, electronics, electrical engineering, computer science. Okay, and then we were evolving, of course. Nobody were talking about cybersecurity of artificial intelligence 30 years ago. Yeah, that was a non-issue. But there were already robotics, because it was the first wave of robotics, the very crude, hard robotics. And now robotics went down, and then suddenly, because of technology evolution, robotics came up again. So we were diversifying already and growing, etc., in different areas. And we are always ready to tackle new challenges. For instance, we have we have 13 research centers, but we have a bioengineering center. Of course, it's not a bioengineering in the sense of the medicine and cells and immunology. No, it's bioengineering in the sense of medical devices. So we are working strongly with health, but always with our engineering basis. We work with doctors. We have projects to help doctors in Parkinson, implantation of electrodes in the brain, analyzing signals and doing signal recognition, etc., etc., etc. So we try to diversify into different areas, but always in partnerships, because we cannot dominate all the areas. We want to be very strong in certain areas to help then others in agriculture, in health, in industry, etc. So that's our motto: science with impact.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Jose. This is a good place to stop, I think, this presentation, and then we will return to you in the plenary debate in a little while. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you.
So now it's time to move on to our next presentation by Sir Peter Glickman. And Peter is the chair of the International Network of Government Science Advice, INGSA, which I hope many of you are familiar with. Otherwise, I would encourage you to take a look. It's really an interesting and effective global organization for coordinating science advice and building competences. So Peter is also president-elect of the International Science Council, and from 2009 to 2018, he was the first chief scientific advisor to the prime ministers of New Zealand. And in his everyday life, he heads the Koi2 Center for Informed Futures at University of Auckland. So over to you, Peter, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you to the Portuguese Embassy of the United Kingdom for having me at this meeting. As David just said, in 2009, I was approached by the then Prime Minister and asked to establish the science advisory system in New Zealand. Up to that time, there had been really nothing in New Zealand other than the occasional request of government to, and it was a very occasional request to the National Academy. The science advisory system in New Zealand is a simplified version derived from the United Kingdom system. It's apolitical, it's independent, and all the science advisors are effectively seconded academics to maintain their independence. Importantly, its primary role is to advise the executive of government, that is the Prime Minister and ministers and heads of the various ministries, which makes it very distinctive. And I think it's important to think about that distinction, for example, from the role of the system that was described with regard to the European Union. What was particularly distinctive in New Zealand in the development of the science advisory system was the decision made to focus particularly on the social sciences, and so that there are in all the major social science related departments embedded science advisors, as well as in the more traditional departments in which you find them. Also, the science advisory mechanism is well linked. The Committee of Science Advisors also invites to be present at its meetings the Chief Economist of Treasury, the Government Statistician, and, as appropriate, the President of the National Academy. I think what emerged was very exciting, namely, as time went on and confidence in the system grew, the government started to allow the science advisors, and in fact request the science advisors, to take an active role in the annual budget process and providing advice to Treasury on the evidence base for bids that were put in by government departments. It's really quite an extraordinary development. There's not one question in public policy where science cannot help the policymaker, but often the policymaker does not realise that science could help them, or thinks that perhaps Google or Wikipedia is enough to get that knowledge from. And this is where I think the science advisor embedded in government departments or in government ministries at the highest level as a member of leadership teams is so important, and why having a science advisor close and accessible to the head of cabinet and to the Prime Minister makes for a different process that is quite important. But we must remember that science does not make policy. It informs policy alongside many other considerations that policymakers and politicians must consider, where it's public opinion, electoral contract, fiscal priorities, diplomatic impact, and so forth. And it's critical, if the science advisor is to be trusted, that the science advisor understands that their role is not to take on the role of the policymaker or the politician. It's critical to trust that the science advisor understands the limits of their role. On the other hand, we've also seen in the last year the issue of science in policy making being used as a cover for political decisions. How often have we heard from politicians around the world in the last year of the COVID crisis the comment, "We are just following the science," when manifestly there have been political considerations in play. This is a real challenge, and I think is one of the reasons why the issues of science advice can be so contested, when it's thought that it's the science advisory mechanisms providing that advice, when in fact it's a political decision being justified on the basis of science. I think we're at the challenge of whether the experience of COVID really does spill over to the normative processes of science advice and policy making. COVID has not yet led to that much reflection or generalisation on the role of science advice. The INSA, the organisation I chair, has been following science advisory mechanisms in over 120 countries during the COVID crisis with the policy tracker, which is on the website. And it's apparent, and as far as I can tell, with the exception of perhaps one country, no country has yet moved from having perhaps an ad hoc system prior to the COVID to a more finalised system now. And that begs the question of whether the science advisory mechanisms needed in crises and those needed in ordinary policy making are the same. Science advice has multiple purposes. It has obviously a critical role in crisis management and perhaps even more in risk assessment before the crisis emerges. It has a role in forecasting, although it's a different skill set. We use science advice in government, as the previous speaker mentioned, all the time in regulatory advice, and there's now an emergent challenge in regulatory advice with the fast-moving nature of technologies. But what we're really focusing on, I think, in this discussion is the role of science advice in normative policy making. It's used there to make sure that the policymaker understands the system of focus, the options that might exist for change in the system in a way that the policymaker may desire, the spillover effects, good or bad, that might come from each option, and actually the evaluation of those options so that the policymaker can make the choice between those options. And there's also the complexity that there are very different audiences for different kinds of science advice, be it the executive government, the legislature, and it varies in different countries what the role of the legislature is, officialdom, that is the bureaucracy and officials, and of course the public and the science community itself. And that's why there has to be an ecosystem of actors. It's not one system. There's an ecosystem with some people inside the system, like science advisors, some outside, like national academies, commissions, committees, scientific bodies, universities, and so forth. But the differences of these roles are not always appreciated, and issues can emerge when roles are confused or conflated. For example, the role of the European Commission, of science advice to the European Commission, which is fundamentally a regulatory body, is very different to the role of an executive of government when it's considering direct decision making on a day-by-day basis. And that's why we must be careful when we talk about concepts of transparency of science advice to distinguish between when formal and deliberative advice is prepared by way of reports, most often and most generally usually from scientific academies, from the more informal nature of advice that happens in the corridors of ministries and governments where there are embedded science advisors. And it's a really subtle but important point. One of the things we've seen in COVID is that there can be competition for access to decision makers, and the attitudes of scientists who have access and the attitudes of scientists who are jealous of not having access can create issues. And we've seen that create public confusion in a number of countries. Those outside the system can afford to be advocates for what they think or want to argue for, where those inside the system have a very different role to play, that of brokerage, and I'll discuss that in a moment. Those outside the system can act in different ways from those that act inside the system. Those outside the system generally have only one point of impact on the policy process, when they're asked to give input or when they lobby for input. Those inside are more likely to be able to take part in the brainstorming at the beginning of a policy cycle or in the fine-tuning at the end of the cycle. I think we need to be careful in this discussion to distinguish two fundamental components in science advice. The first is evidence synthesis, that is bringing the evidence together from the plurality of inputs that address a particular question. And there, academies in particular have a critically important role to play in making sure there's a plurality of input and that the evidence is appropriately synthesized. But when it comes to brokerage, that is the transfer of knowledge from the science community to the policy community, or the request from the policy community to the science community, there's some different skills needed. They're almost diplomatic rather than technical. That's about explaining the uncertainties, what is known, what is unknown, and there are always unknowns, making sure there's an alignment between what the policymaker needs to know and what the science community is able to deliver, to make sure that the policymakers actually understand the implications of the data, of the knowledge that's transferred. And I've seen several bad errors made in that regard. And they also need to be aware of the rhetorical power of numbers and graphs. And I think we've seen again that conflated at times in the COVID situation, where uncertainty has been inadequately explained. Fundamentally, this is all about trust. And as been mentioned by the previous speakers, trust needs to be there between those giving advice and those receiving advice, between the individual or the system giving advice and the public and the media, and finally with the science community itself. Now, I just want to make one last comment before finishing, and it relates to a question that was asked earlier. That is the role of science advice in the international arena. It's particularly difficult, and it's particularly difficult in the current unstable state of the multilateral system. Some agencies of the UN system are technical and have very good technical inputs into what they do. But virtually all the agencies have political and diplomatic oversight, and that can create real issues of nationalism and other dimensions to the filters that come on scientific advice. But in the end, the real issue is the structures in general at the level of the United Nations itself, at the General Assembly and the Security Council do not exist. And there is no formal process of getting science advice into those systems. There are suggestions have been made. There was a failed experiment of a United Nations Secretary General Science Advisory Mechanism, but that was not funded, and it actually reported to the Director General of UNESCO, not to the United Nations, and had no effective mandate. I think what would be far more effective is for there to be to use the major group system, which brings the Inter-Academy Panel, the International Science Council, and the World Federation of Engineering bodies together to be a conduit from the United Nations, which recognises the major group system, out to the scientific community on issues that matter. And there's some evidence that that's beginning to happen. For instance, United Nations Development Programme has very effectively used the International Science Council in its redevelopment of the Human Development System report and index. I think if we're honest, the UN system has not done well in the COVID situation, and we're seeing a lot of issues emerging with the issues of vaccine nationalism and so forth. Increasingly, it is apparent that Track 2 organisations such as INGSA and the ISC have an important role to play. Finally, I want to mention the role of diplomats, because we are here hosted by the United Kingdom's embassy. Increasingly, it's obvious that science advice is critical in the diplomatic community, because ultimately in the multilateral system, it's diplomats that make much of the final decision making. And to have science advice embedded as it is in the United Kingdom within a foreign ministry adds much to the potential of the science of the foreign ministry to play its role in the multilateral system, but also to make decisions on its own national interest around science and technology in ways that it could not done. John Kerry, who was formerly the Secretary of State to Obama, made the famous statement once that I need a science advisor beside me at meeting to tell me when I need science to help me make better decisions. So at the end of the day, in the global arena, there are real challenges, but I think individual countries, by strengthening the role of science advice and technology advice within their foreign ministries, can do much to improve outcomes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Very excellent, very comprehensive, and I can tell you that you already came somewhat ahead of our conversations, because several questions popped up about the added value of transnational collaboration, which you already mentioned. So let me return to another question we got from the audience, which regards the division of labor between policy making and science now in these urgent times where people are speaking about being led by the sciences or following the science. And it's a question regarding how, in your advice, factoring in ethics, considerations of justice and well-being, sort of on top of technical advice. So how do you look upon the role of ethics in science advice as being complementary to the policy making process?
I think it's key. I mean, I think it comes down to the problem that science is the wrong word. I mean, if we were speaking in German and using the word Wissenschaft, we would have a far better understanding of the role of science advice. It's not just about technical advice. It's not just about social science advice. It's also about the consequences of that advice for society and the state. And therefore, when I was in the role of presenting options to government, of course, I had to be aware and make sure the government was aware of issues, say, over the use of data and the ethical issues of government use or misuse of data. Those are automatically part of good science advice. I think to imagine it that it's a technocratic issue alone does ill service to the ability of science to help governments. At the end of the day, policy making is always a values judgment. And I think that it's not for a science advisor to put their values on the table and say, these are my values, therefore you must do that. But it is the role to say, this is where values will be contested, and government needs to be aware that values will be contested. I mean, this is the realm of what most science advice is generally about now, which is post-normal science. It's actually dealing with the issues where the facts are incomplete. No matter how much science is done, the facts will still be incomplete. There are real uncertainties, there are caveats on the knowledge, and yet decisions are urgent, and the issue interfaces with public values, which by definition are in dispute. And that's, of course, when we're dealing with anti-vax, where we're dealing with some of the decisions made in COVID over health versus human right, freedom, or whatever has been the discussion, or economics. These are post-normal issues, and we must use post-normal approaches to deal with them.
Right. So I guess that's also an argument for supporting multidisciplinarity in the way we're providing science advice.
Absolutely, and I think one of the issues that, you know, in the work I'm now leading, because you may not know, but I'm leading this global project on COVID scenarios. What are the vectors of uncertainty and how will they play into how the COVID scenario plays out in conjunction with WHO and UNDRR? What is clear is, yes, we need to have virologists and epidemiologists at the table, but we needed economists, political scientists, decision theorists, human behaviorists, ethicists also at that table. Otherwise, we couldn't even analyze the problem.
Exactly. No, that's very pertinent. We have one final question from the audience, Peter, and it's from Rhoda Jennings. She's asking about your view on the necessity of ensuring the transparency and independence of the embedded science advisor. So this, I guess, is not a question about the external independent institutes, but about the independence.
It's a really hard question,
right?
Because anything on paper can be transparent. of course, anything on paper can and is in most democracies going to be transparent in some way anyhow. And I always made it a principle that when I provided a report to government, I told them it will be made public in 3 days' time or 2 days' time or whatever. So that was, but of course, you cannot be transparent when you're having a discussion with the Prime Minister and he's wanting, should I be thinking about that? Should I be forming a policy about that? Is dealing with this particular issue important? Or when I'm saying to the Prime Minister, can you please put a focus on this particular issue of water quality or whatever? That's a different kind of advice. It's an interaction between the science community and the way I guaranteed my independence may sound strange, but I wrote into the terms of reference of the science advisor, because I wrote the terms of reference, that I also had the right to talk to the opposition in Parliament.
Right.
And therefore, I would go and see the leader of the opposition on a regular basis. And the first question I would ask him is, am I being political or am I being a neutral advisor? And I got into a routine of doing that every few weeks to months as part of the process. I also made sure that my website, which I'm sure you used to look at, David, had not just the formal reports on, but a lot of my thinking. I would actually explore my thinking in public by blogs and essays in public so that people could see how the office was thinking about issues before they even became advice.
Right. Yes, exactly, to ensure the transparency and the openness. Which
but I cannot obviously go transparent and say, right, the Prime Minister and I just had this discussion. No. I think he was an idiot because he didn't listen to my advice. I mean, because you've got to also accept that politicians will override your advice for reasons which are part of democracy.
Right.
I mean, that's just part of the democratic process.
I guess that there also needs to be a space in which you can form your opinions, and in that space you don't necessarily are willing or in a position to make them openly available while
the most useful discussions I think that embedded science advisors do is that initial brainstorming, be it with ministers or senior officials who say, we've got a problem of, let's say, water quality in our rural sector. What things could we do to change it? And it's that informal discussion, and they may say, well, it's all too hard, we're not going to go there, or we say, let's get a report, or they say, this is really important, we better put some real effort into addressing the question. That is where you can have your most impact.
Great, Peter, thank you so much for that, and please stay on for the final plenary debate. We will now move on to Carol Mandel, who is the Chief Scientific Advisor at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the UK. She was appointed to the role of International Science Envoy at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in January 2021. And she's also a professor of extragalactic astronomy and head of astrophysics at the University of Bath. And we have really been looking forward to your presentation this morning, Carol. So welcome to the podium.
Thank you, David, and it's a great pleasure to join you all today, and my honour to follow such eminent speakers who have really laid the foundation out for me to finish with my closing remarks. So I would like to give you a sense of the very mature and deeply embedded science advice mechanisms that we have available to us in the UK government. And the very first, I think, record of science advisors go all the way back to Winston Churchill, who called on big scientific experts within the academic community during the Second World War to provide him with technical advice. And then in 1966, the first cross-Whitehall government chief scientific advisor was appointed, Zolly Zuckerman. And from then, the system has really evolved, and we have a very mature system that is both deeply embedded, quite broad and extensive and out into the science and industry community, and is also very agile. And so what I'd like to do in my presentation is give you a sense of the status quo, and then use the last year in COVID to show you how we've mobilised in probably the most complex and long-standing science advice need that that system has been tested with. So as you've heard, the science advice mechanism in the UK, we have chief scientific advisors. There's one in each government department. As a chief scientific advisor, we are civil servants, and so we are governed by the Civil Service Code. Most of us are seconded from academia, so we are leading academics and scientists in our own right. And following Peter's description of science, I will use science in the broadest sense. I know sometimes the word science conjures up the sense of, somebody in a lab with a white coat. So to be very clear, we don't have a lab in the basement of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, but we do understand the scientific method. We understand how to challenge assumptions, and we understand how to provide robust evidence. I've often been asked what's an astrophysicist doing in the Foreign Office, and I think that goes to the heart of what a good science advisor is, that we can bring both our technical expertise within our own field, but we can also apply that expertise more broadly across lots of other research fields. We also know how to draw networks, and we also know how to engage with researchers and innovators across the piece. So within the UK, we have the science advice mechanism provided through our CSAs, the government chief scientific advisor, who's currently Sir Patrick Vallance, who many of you will have seen on the daily briefings with the Prime Minister because of the COVID crisis. He actually provides science advice directly to the Prime Minister. The chief scientific advisors meet on a weekly basis, and so we are networked across Whitehall, and we meet with one another to make sure that we have good communication. And we are each hired and employed by our department. So there's real buy-in from each of our government departments in terms of having a CSA and having a CSA mechanism within each department. That's really important so that our advice is heard at the most senior levels. And our role as chief scientific advisors within our departments is both to work closely with our policy teams and also to work with the emergency advice mechanism, which I'll describe shortly, but also to advise our ministers and our secretaries of state, and in my case, the Foreign Secretary. Across Whitehall, we also have the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology. This is a fantastic unit that's now over 20 years old, that do very deep evidence synthesis. They reach out into the academic community and the industry community, and they do very deep pieces of peer-reviewed science synthesis. And they produce these very accessible post notes, all of which are online. And these are available for our busy parliamentarians who may not be science confident, but they actually can pick up one of these post notes about a particular science issue, literally on their way into Westminster. I mean, now it's mostly done digitally at the moment in the COVID crisis. And so they're able to pick up these post notes, get a very deep sense of the science advice around a particular policy issue that they might be having to tackle immediately in Parliament that day, and actually be able to read that in a very accessible way. So that's a fantastic and deeply embedded resource. We also have our select committee mechanism, which is the parliamentary scrutiny of government. So the Science and Technology Select Committee can draw evidence from experts across the country and into government as well. They'll often call chief scientific advisors to come and give evidence based on a particular issue that the Select Committee may be addressing at that particular time. So that's also a great mechanism for scrutiny and challenge. And then more broadly, of course, we connect very closely with our National Academies of Science, the Royal Society, the Royal Academy of Engineering, and right out into our professional bodies. We also work very closely with our university sector, and so the Universities UK, which is an umbrella organisation for all of our universities, and then their international facing UUKI. So I work very closely with them from the Foreign Ministry perspective. I think the other thing that the UK has that is unique is our Science and Innovation Network. So these are over 100 science and innovation attaches who are embedded in our embassies. And as Peter mentioned, making sure that our ambassadors are fully confident and upskilled in the science advice mechanism and how they can use that to build stakeholder relationships within the countries that they're embedded, and also to bring that advice and those relationships back into the UK. So the UK has an internationally world-renowned science system. We have world-leading scientists and world-leading universities, and international collaboration really is at the heart of our success. I am an international scientist in my own right, so I've always worked internationally, and then I've realised when I moved into government that I've also always been an international science diplomat without realising it. And science really is conducted without sight of national borders. We work as scientists with the best collaborators around the world because we want to tackle the questions, the scientific questions that we're addressing within our field. And I think that's really what makes that international science collaboration so important. And our Science and Innovation officers help us to build those stakeholder relationships and also to project our international excellence. This goes, I think, also to the heart of some of the questions that the audience have been asking today about the science advice mechanism into multilateral bodies like the United Nations or the OECD. And so we think it's really important in the UK that our ambassadors are fully skilled and enabled to make sure that they can bring the best scientific evidence to the table. And I think one of the very impressive examples of this was during the Salisbury Poisoning, so the Novichok attack that the UK experienced a few years ago. And it was really the very deep scientific evidence and the quality of that evidence that the then Prime Minister Theresa May took to the United Nations that was the most powerful discriminant in terms of the science diplomacy and the decision within the United Nations to actually to sanction Russia for that attack. And I think that really goes to the heart of the importance of the science. So one can't do science diplomacy unless the science itself is excellent. And so what we have in the UK is a very robust science funding mechanism. So our UK Research and Innovation body, which is the funding agency, it's an arm's length body of government. It has independence, and so it uses what's called the Haldane principle to peer review the scientific proposals that come from the science community. Government allocates funding to that agency, and that's then allocated out across all of our physical, engineering, biological, medical research sciences, and also out into our social and psychology sciences. So it's a very important interdisciplinary body in the sense that it can fund expertise very deeply, but it can also bring that together. Our innovation body, Innovate UK, is also part of that umbrella organisation, and so we have a very close linkage between our fundamental foundational research all the way through our innovation pipeline and out into our UK prosperity and security, both on a national and an international basis. That then ultimately also feeds through to trade and that wider prosperity ecosystem. And so all of this comes together in a steady state to make sure that we have a very agile and innovative pipeline from our fundamental research all the way through to our national prosperity and security. And that then brings the science advice mechanism right into the heart of government, where we work very closely with policymakers. And, I think we've heard, Professor Chris Whitty, our Chief Medical Officer, and Sir Patrick Vallance say very clearly many times that our scientists and our science advisors do not form policy. We advise policymakers, and then it's politicians who make the final decision. That's very important because our politicians, of course, are democratically elected and are accountable to the country through the ballot box. So it's not scientists that drive government, it's government that uses that science advice to make the best possible science evidence-based policy making. And I think this has really come to the fore for me through the COVID crisis in the last 12 months. So last January, when we first heard the emerging news of this unusual virus in the city of Wuhan, the science advice mechanism sprung into action in the UK. So we have a body called the Science Advisory Group in Emergencies. And this is actually a mechanism rather than a standing group. So Sir Patrick Vallance is responsible as the Government Chief Scientific Advisor to provide science advice to the Prime Minister, both in emergencies and also strategic science advice. And when there is an emergency that requires complex and cross-disciplinary science evidence, Sir Patrick has this mechanism that he can pull on. And so SAGE is a mechanism that he can scramble to bring in the right experts into the room at the right time for the emergency that he is actually providing advice on to the Prime Minister. In 2019, there were floods in the UK. There was a dam in North Yorkshire that was at threat of bursting and flooding downstream the villages that were there. And of course, Sir Patrick was able to bring in the right experts at that point. I was not brought into that because I work internationally, and so that was not an emergency or a crisis that needed my science advice. But when the Wuhan virus was first notified to the World Health Organization, that was really when the science advice mechanism came to its fore. So Sir Patrick convened a very broad and wide-reaching SAGE group, co-chaired with Professor Chris Whitty in this instance because it was a medical crisis. And SAGE was very broadly convened. So we had public health experts, we had virologists, immunologists, social scientists. And the way this was structured was with a number of subgroups that feed into the main SAGE advice mechanism. And it's important to think about these subgroups, which now cover everything from environmental, physics and engineering, because obviously we know that this is an airborne virus, and through to the logistics, the genomics, and the epidemiology and the virology, and then throughout advising into the vaccine task force, which is another body in Whitehall. And it's important to think about the different mechanisms that are in play in SAGE because, as our speakers have said before, it's also quite a challenge for individual scientists to provide science advice to government. And we've seen through COVID that it's not possible for one single scientist to take that load, not least of all because it's a long-standing crisis that we have continued to give science advice to government on, and that science advice has evolved as the crisis has evolved. And so the way we've done this is the subcommittees really are the place where the academics and the experts in the field can come together. They've been working phenomenally hard, morning, noon and night and through weekends to make sure that they're pushing the frontiers of knowledge. As Peter said, working at the frontiers of uncertainty is also one of the biggest challenges for science advice. And that's really the place where our subject matter experts can really have those very vigorous debates about the scientific research that they're doing live for this crisis, because this is new research that's being commissioned. That's the place where they're able to do that research. They're able to compare their different groups' research results and sometimes discuss differences and really challenge one another. So that challenge function is really important. And having the privacy to do that safely is also really important, away from the glare of the press, so that they can really be vigorous in that challenge. Those pieces of research then are published in the research literature, but at the same time, a consensus paper is then provided to the main SAGE body. And so those of us in SAGE will then read those advice papers. They're very clearly formulated and they're all publicly available on the government website, where the bounds of uncertainty and the confidence in this consensus decisions that are then presented to SAGE are very clearly laid out. SAGE then is able to provide additional challenge and scrutiny of those papers, and then we produce a consensus statement on whatever the issues are that we happen to be discussing, and we provide that very quickly into our policy teams. Those policy teams are then able to take that advice in the round, and they're also able to take in other considerations and provide robust policy evidence to our ministers. And that, I think, has worked incredibly well throughout the year, where we've been tackling some incredibly challenging problems. We've also made sure that we brought in social science very acutely in there as well, because obviously we're talking about people in this pandemic. This is not just a mechanistic or a technological challenge that we're dealing with. And that's also been really important in how we've provided advice, for example, to Treasury on some of the financial packages that have been brought into play to support people, for example, to self-isolate. So all of that has been science evidence based, and it's been experts that have been commissioning and gathering that real live evidence so that we've got the most agile and up-to-date evidence to advise our policy teams. So a very rich and diverse mechanism. We also do lots of reflection. We go back and we learn and we look to see what has worked, what hasn't worked, and what we need to adapt as we move forward. And I think, that the COVID crisis has been, as I say, the deepest and most long-standing crisis that we've had to continue to adapt to and learn as we've been moving forward and bringing in new experts to make sure that we provide resilience, because we can't expect one expert to provide all of the evidence throughout all of this. And to finish, what I'd like to finish with is really a name check to the excellent public engagement ecosystem that we have in the UK. And I think this is also really important for our science advice mechanism to then dock into, to help our public understand and trust in the science and the science advice that we're doing. And again, this has not just been stood up for crisis. This is something that has been being developed over many, many years, all the way through to our funding system. So our junior researchers are encouraged to engage with the public on their research. We have some fantastic science museums that also help in that translation between the science that experts do and how that is applicable to society. And then, of course, we've got some wonderful companies and corporations that will help us with that in the broadest sense. So many of you will have seen Sir David Attenborough's Blue Planet and all of his wonderful science engagement that really helps people to connect with the big global challenges and the big issues, probably in a much more powerful way than any of us as scientists could do with a single plot or a single graph. And so all of that comes together to make sure that our public feel connected with the science that we do, and that they can also understand how they can bring their questions to the fore. And this has been very important in addressing, for example, vaccine hesitancy, making sure that media and journalists have direct access to our science and our science advisors, I think has been a really critical part in building that trust. So I'll stop there and I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. That was very comprehensive as well. And I think that for many of us, at least, that's doing studies on science advice and helping other governments to to enhance their science advisory systems. Often we do look to the UK and to find inspiration in this very rich and diverse ecosystem that you have set up. I wanted to come back to one of the issues that you mentioned in the end of your talk about the literacy on behalf of science, on behalf of citizens, and perhaps also journalists. So throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, you have seen definitely the chief science advisor, but also many other scientists taking center stage in political discussions and also in press briefings and in the news. But according to your opinion, how has that been reflected in the wider public? Is there a basic understanding of how these mechanisms work?
Yeah, so I think there are two parts here. So we have a body called the Science Media Centre, which is an independent body, and it acts as a translator. So it can provide access to scientific experts, it can provide comments from those scientific experts and a range of comments for media outlets to be able to access quickly. And of course, we have quite a wide range of journalistic structures. We have our local reporters who are very important for our sort of local and agile reporting and scrutiny there, right up to our national outlets, TV and print media. So I think it's been, incredibly transformational to have those journalists be able to access directly to our top scientists, our top science advisors, and right through to the Prime Minister. So we've always had those lobby briefings, but I've also seen that transformation through COVID because we've had to go online. We've seen right through to sort of local journalists asking really searching questions and being given really frank answers back. So you'll have seen, the likes of Professor Chris Whitty say, I'm not going to answer that question because this is where we are with uncertainty, or this is what we're tackling, or this is the really tough message that I want everybody to understand. Right now he's saying we have great optimism with the vaccine rollout, but actually we're not out of the woods. We're on a knife edge. We expect to have problems next winter. And so he's preparing people to think much more clearly and to try to avoid optimism bias, I think, and keeping on making sure that we can communicate that to the public, not in a corporate comms way, a kind of, here's some PR that we want you all to absorb, but actually really having that two-way dialogue, I think is really important. People are busy, people are experiencing all sorts of strains within their own life, and they need to know that the experts are acting in good faith, and also to understand, what we don't understand, and what we're doing to find out, I think is also a real linchpin in terms of that engagement and trust.
So perhaps a related follow-up question, Carol, I can tell you from the Danish ecosystem that there has been some reluctance in getting second opinions on public policies, that if you were to convene independent expert groups that might come up with let's say alternative or competing advice, or even give comments on the based on the consensus in the academic literature, that could be seen as a weakness in the official advisory systems or the internal science services. But I can see from the UK discussion across the board that here the idea to have your advice tested and reviewed and put under scrutiny has been part of the process rather than an obstacle to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there will always be, we have freedom of speech, so people are free to express their ideas. But I think what really grounds us is going back to the evidence, allowing challenge of that evidence. And really that's at the heart of integrity in our science process as well. So of course, peer review is, the very heart of peer review, and good peer review is that challenge by one's peers and the right to reply. So we do that as naturally as academics. I think you also have to look very carefully about the transparency of your system. So of course, good peer review also involves making sure that you declare your funding sources. So I think there's integrity within our science system, which is absolutely vital. So we do lots of work on that. And I know you've had some questions on ethics. If we are confident that we continue to check ourselves within our universities, that we have good systems, that the science itself is built on integrity, that we publish that in an open peer-reviewed way. And that's something that we've pushed very hard for within the UK. And I know with colleagues across Europe, that open peer-reviewed and that open access to literature is very, very important, because then we can do the best we can. And it then means when we have to draw on that for scientific advice to build consensus, we don't then have to go back and say, is this a reputable journal, or is this a reputable result, or how do we interrogate this piece of science that, claims the moon is made of green cheese, but who said that? Well, it was a cheese company, for example. I'm not casting aspersions on the cheese industry here, but one has to be aware of the whole ecosystem and the integrity that we must continue to scrutinise. So we have very robust mechanisms within our universities about research integrity, about how we treat our, our short-term contract researchers and how we develop career prospects for them. So I think that whole integrity in the system is the foundation of that good science advice. Then when you say to your politicians, yes, there isn't a black and white answer on this but this is how we're pushing the frontiers of knowledge, they can have much more confidence in going to the public, because obviously as a politician you sometimes want certainty. You want to be able to say the answer is this and this is what we're going to do about it. And we often sometimes, I think, unfairly push our politicians in that direction, and we see this sometimes in the media, that this can be portrayed as a weakness, a U-turn, or changing your mind. So helping our politicians to understand when the advice changes, why it has changed, and what action is required from that advice change, because you've had all of that challenge in the system before you get to that point. That's how you give the confidence to your politicians and your policy teams to move forward with the advice that you provide.
So if I hear you correctly here, I think what also Sir Peter mentioned, that building trust in the long term and securing consistency in the entire food chain of evidence and science is really a prerequisite also for having effective crisis management, and it's something that you really need in order to be able to also gain the trust when things are getting a bit more intense.
Absolutely, and I think when you are under crisis, you're under time pressure, you're under public scrutiny, and everybody is desperate for an answer. I mean, with COVID, we had lives at stake, and that you can't be under greater pressure than that. And, the tendency can also be to make a very fast decision. And so it takes real courage to be able to say, we need to be cautious on this, despite the fact there's great pressure to make a fast decision. How you communicate that is also really important. So when we saw the variant of concern emerging in Kent just before Christmas in the UK, we were interrogating the data, and there's also a value judgment where you say, we see a signal in the data. It's not statistically significant yet, but we have all sorts of other ancillary bits of information that are raising our concerns here. So at what point do you take that concern to your policy teams and your ministers? Sooner than later is always better, but how you explain the uncertainties and when and how to respond in a policy way is also, a really deep skill. And it's one, again, that we've learned through the year. And I think we handled very well at Christmas, because transparency was very important then. That also encouraged other countries to have the confidence to be transparent. And in fact, using the example of Denmark, I worked very closely with colleagues in your country around the Danish mink crisis, and that was for me a phenomenal piece where obviously Denmark has this wonderful genomic system, great transparency, very fast policy response, and we worked very closely, very quickly with the scientific community and also the advice mechanism, but bringing the scientific experts into the same digital room. And that was at one of the meetings that I chaired, very quickly on a Saturday afternoon, everybody scrambled. That science to science, almost a brain translation, was very powerful, but actually having all the other people in the room, the public health experts, the animal health experts, the logistics experts, was really very important to help us both support our Danish colleagues and Danish government, but also to help us to inform our policymakers in the UK about the appropriate response. And then ultimately we worked with governments around the world on COVID and mink and the genomic sequencing, because we have the world's largest publicly available human genomics database for COVID in the UK, which we've made publicly available so scientists around the world can use that, because in the same way that we've supported universal access to vaccines, we're not safe until everybody's safe. So building that capacity in other countries is really, really critical.
So here we have a very concrete example of the added value of transnational collaborations in science.
Absolutely.
Carol, I will now thank you so much for your intervention and your presentation this morning. And then I will invite all the other speakers to join us for a final plenary debate. And I can see Renzo is back. And I don't know if Jose is also coming. Yes. So thank you to all of you for having made your presentations and engaged in some of the Q&As we already got from the audience, and they still keep coming in. So what I will do now is I will just pick up on one of the questions, and then I will see if you have the willingness also to engage with each other or raise some of the questions or return, as it were, to some of the issues that we already raised. And one question is particular for Portugal, but I would hope we could generalize a bit here, and it's about the composition of a well-functioning ecosystem. As we have heard only today in a short seminar like this, in 2 hours, there are many different advisory mechanisms. And what do you see as a good practice for the composition of such a system? How are they overlapping? How are they competing? How do you put together your national ecosystem in a way that really develops timely and effective science advice? Perhaps I can start with you, Peter.
Well, I think it's a matrix. It's a matrix between function and organisation. On the function side, you have issues of knowledge generation, which of course universities do and research centres do. You have knowledge evidence synthesis, which can come through think tanks, it can come through universities, it can particularly come through national academies with their ability to bring a plurality of inputs. And then you have knowledge brokerage, which can come through science advisory mechanisms embedded within the system, or it comes through a variety of systems that we've talked about. It partly depends on how the executive of government is formed, whether it's a parliamentary system, whether it's a presidential system, what's the role of legislators in different countries, whether they're involved early in policy formation or only in legislation. So, I mean, I think to generalise, you have to know your local context, but I think you do need a matrix of functions. Who's going to look after crisis management, science advice and emergencies, which the UK has been preeminent in thinking about, but also technology assessment, forecasting at the other end of the time base as well. And then in your system, it depends on your academies, the culture of committees versus individuals. All of this comes into play, but I think look at the function first and decide what functions are needed, and then build it within your local constitutional and cultural and historical arrangements.
Right, thank you. Perhaps I can ask you the same, Renzo, and perhaps I would say that looking from an outside perspective at an institution like the European Commission, you will see a lot of science advisory services within SAM, within the Group of Ethics, the Joint Research Center, and also, as Carol also mentioned, you're also stimulating quite a lot of policy-oriented research through your funding programs. So how do you coordinate or put together this mix of different sources of science advice?
Yeah, I just continue what Peter Glickman was saying about the metrics, and there should be indeed an integration in this. There should be a symphony, not a cacophony, like an orchestra. There are many instruments, and they should play music and not just make noise. And European level, we have more than 700 established a group of experts, which are all publicly, by the way, you can find, because we are very transparent, as you know. And indeed, the function and the purpose give the structure, and the goal is determinant. We have at the level of the European institutions, because you have Council, you have Parliament, you have Commission, and etc., etc. Within us, you know well, because I think my colleagues of the Joint Research Center are also collaborating with you. I know that they are collaborating with you, and they are, and it is important that it is the case. So we have a role for the European Commission. The European Commission, everybody of us, when we go out of the door, there is no longer Joint Research Center, DG Research and Innovation, Secretary General, and so on. It's the European Commission. And when we go out from Europe, there is also not so much Commission, Council, Parliament. There is European institutions. So this means that we have a coordination in-house, of course, to see who can do better, also with the resources that we have, the instruments, the legal instruments that we have, the legal basis, the mandate that we have, but also the people that we have and the resources that we have. There is also an integration to do at European level. The Directorate General for Research and Innovation has created the ESAF, the European Science Advisors Forum. And it is important for us because this has been created from a letter, official letter from us to the ambassadors, to the permanent representatives of the member states of the European Union. So this ESAF has a formal, official you want to say, I don't know what does it mean official, formal for sure entity. So it is important that we consider, and probably there is scope to reinforce in the economy and ecosystem, to reinforce the presence of the ESAF and the interactions with what we do at the level of the Commission. I think personally, a personal opinion, but the advantage of this kind of gremia is to develop ideas, and of my personal opinion is I see room for improvement, room for reinforcing the presence of the ESAF, the participation, the engagement of the ESAF. And this means also engagement and dialogue with the member states. Member states are sovereign, they do what they want. It's not no doubt about this. But we can have a conversation with the member states, and ESAF maybe can help us also in this. And then we have international level. We have a synergy at international level, and Peter Glickman can teach us. Sorry, I was not listening at your presentation because I had other things to do. My apologies. But I assume that you have mentioned the INSA and you have mentioned the international level. The creation of an ecosystem of actors and different actors means also changing culture. So a creation of a new culture of science basis, of evidence-based decision shaping. You remember my differences in this sense. So I think that we are on a way, on a path. You picked up my concept of COVID in the sense of the science to policy advice as a stress test of the science to policy advice, as a case bed of science to policy advice, because brought these higher in the political agenda. And it's legitimate that we ask ourselves, are we providing the best science to policy advice? Could we do better? How can we improve? Because there will be another crisis, unfortunately. There will be not the last crisis of the mankind, or womankind. So it will be another crisis. So it is the moment for us to make this kind of thinking and to develop, reinforce this that we all together call the ecosystem. So yes, the matrix, more integration, and I think that this kind of event like the one of today, the other events, are precious because allow us to gather, to develop ideas, and to set the path for our next steps. Right. We have work to do.
Yes, great. So that also goes back to Peter's point about being blunt and perhaps using this occasion to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses within our systems. So I think that's on top of COVID is a good idea. But I wanted also to invite you in here, Jose, because the question was actually originally posed to the Portuguese system. I believe it came actually from a colleague in the JRC who's now working on mapping and providing services for the local ecosystems. And the question goes that what do you see as the main challenges for establishing different science advisory mechanisms in Portugal?
Well, we all know that uncertainty is a key issue. There's a very fast evolution in technological areas, and then there are economical, social, and geopolitical problems. For instance, the largest auto assembly factory of Ford Volkswagen in Portugal stopped because there are no ships, no electronic ships, and the whole factory stopped. So all the ecosystem has to help on policy advice, and I agree very much with what Peter said about the knowledge generation and knowledge brokerage and different actors. Of course, we have university, national academies, science institutions, but we have also technical centers and industry associations in sectors that have some kind of business intelligence and market intelligence, and this is very important. Regarding advisory committees, I have participated in several, and even for the European Commission also. I'm a member of the high-level group of Manufacture, and at the moment that's where I met Renzo Tomellini. Yeah, and what I see is that you need senior people with a transversal encompassing knowledge, some with strong scientific backgrounds, others with more market business intelligence knowledge. They should all know the ecosystem. They cannot be, in their Babel towers, closed in their offices or labs. They should have a strong international network, because all this is global. And I think that's what the government tried to do with this National Council for Science, Technology and Innovation. There are 21 people, plus the president of the Portuguese Science Foundation, the president of the Portuguese National Innovation Agency, and the president of YAPME, which is a board to support companies and investments. So there are the science financing board, there is the company stimulation to the economy, and there is the innovation agency in between the two. And these council should advise the science minister and the economy minister. But we found out very fast that this council has to advise the prime minister.
All right.
But everything, because innovation and science are also in the ocean and agriculture and health, and that, of course, this council is limited because it's a broad, large scope. Then you have to have experts in different areas, of course. And I noted what you said about what is required to this advice. And a lot is required to this advice. A lot is advised to this advice. And I like very much what Carol Mandel was telling about. UK is a fantastic example. And Anglo-Saxon countries are very strong on doing this. I think in the Mediterranean, we have countries, we have more difficulty in doing those things, but we have to learn fast and put up with those things.
So diversity and unity, diversity and a good matrix, as Peter said, is probably what is needed. We got one final question. We only have 3 minutes left, so that might be convenient because it's a quite juicy question. And I can pose it to you, Carol, and see if I can teach you to answer it. It's about the limitations on science advice. Now with the given case of the AstraZeneca vaccine and the discussions now evolving in Europe and in the UK, do we see here an example of the limits of science advice where the public, the hesitancy and the policy making is really taking over and the science have to step a little bit in the background?
No, I think the opposite. So this goes to my broader comment to draw in the previous question around trust. Is science advice being done to you or is it being done by you? I think that's scalable, whether that's a national science advice mechanism, whether you're feeding into a European science mechanism, where you're waiting for the European Commission to make a grand pronouncement about science advice. No one piece of that can't do it alone. And so everybody has to have an ownership of that system, and they have to have systems that are right in their country. I think Italy is a very good example of this. I worked on a programme supporting Italy both to bring their science community together with their politicians, because the scientists didn't trust the politicians and the politicians didn't trust the scientists. Scientists are lobbying for funding, politicians are going to throw scientists under the bus when the science advice appears to get things wrong. And so building a buffer between them, and that's where the CSA network works very well. We brought them to Cambridge and we had a nice dinner and we explained to them how the UK mechanism worked, and I think we made some progress there. So in this question, I think what's really important is that the European Medical Agency, of course, is the regulatory body. They're looking at the data. They're working very closely with the vaccine companies. Same in the UK, the MHRA. I think we also have looked very closely at the statistics and have great confidence in the safety of the AstraZeneca vaccine. It's absolutely critically important that we use all of the checks and balances that we have embedded in the system and that have been robust for many years for all vaccines. And that's what builds public trust. So this is not the time to be political. This is absolutely the time to look at the science, look at the data, and then translate that so that people can understand the risk, which from the numbers I've seen is it's actually lower than the generic clot rate in the normal population, irrespective of any vaccines. So I'm certainly waiting vigorously for my vaccine call. But that's when you really use your systems to most advantage, when things do become politically heated and people become confused as to what to decide. You go right down to the core of your science advice mechanism. So I'm very confident that everybody will get the right science advice from the data, and that time will help, you know, the countries who are struggling right now to move forward with their vaccine programs positively.
All right. Thank you, Carol. And with those words, I would like to end this wonderful workshop. It's been a pleasure moderating you. We all kept the time, and at least for my part, it was an inspirational discussion, and we touched upon quite a lot of issues pertinent to science advice globally and in our own countries. So I want to thank the speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David, for your chairing. Thank you.
And I don't know if Mara or the embassy have a final word to be made, or if that's not the case, we will close here. And I will thank all the audiences for having listened in.